Hopefully it works. Hopefully there's the old man can figure out how to operate it.
Dinosaur Jr.
Basically. All right, there we go. And we're live. So today we're going to be talking about martial arts, as the three of us have all recently, or not so recently, but within the last year, signed up for jiu-jitsu, well, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and thought it would be interesting to go over the history of martial arts, the implications, and the the differences between them, what are useful, what ones are useful, what ones aren't. So, Price, if you want to just kick us off with some wonderful history.
Sure. So, for definitions of martial arts, any various fighting sport or skill divided into armed, so archery, spearmanship, swordsmanship. If you want to take this into the modern day, shooting, and unarmed, which is basically divided into striking and grappling traditionally. So, start with the old Greeks. They had the Olympic Games, kind of a big deal. I don't think it's really talked about that often. Martial arts with a Western historical tradition, maybe boxing, probably the most. But the Greeks had boxing recorded in the 8th century BC. It was the first thing that was added to the Olympics that wasn't a foot race. So a long, long history there. They wrapped their fists in cowhide, although modern reenactions say that they wrap their fists in cowhide to protect their knuckles and allow them to hit harder and longer, as opposed to softening the blow for their opponents. So one of the oddities of Greek boxing was that they had no ring or time limit, so it ended up being very defensive. And for reasons that don't seem very clear, the Spartans didn't participate in Olympic boxing, which may have been to do with the fact that they considered this sort of defensive style to be dishonorable. And then wrestling was added. Oh, sorry, wrestling was the first sport that wasn't a foot race, was added to the Olympic Games in 700 BC. And that was considered by the Greeks to be the ultimate display of strength. So wrestling people was, Herculean. It's the Chad thing to do. And then if you're truly crazy, you had pancration or pamachian. The term changed depending on the era, which was total combat, or in other words, MMA. And that was introduced to the Olympics as well. And knockouts were common, but most competitions were decided with submissions. And in rare cases, if you killed your opponent, that was considered a victory. And this is another one that the Spartans stopped competing at in the Olympics, because the Olympics added rules such as no eye gouging or biting, and that's it. And the Spartans couldn't stand for that.
Just a
That's
bunch of
over the line.
soft other city states. It's unacceptable.
So an interesting thing with these Greek martial arts, as far as I could tell, is that they don't really include philosophy or religion blended into the martial arts. Obviously, being jacked was a big part of Hercules or other mythological characters, and Hercules was often considered to be the father of the total combat because he would defeat monsters by using wrestling and boxing. But other than the Spartans, who built their whole ethos around warfare and killing each other, beating each other up, there wasn't a strong philosophical bent. And that is an interesting difference with the Eastern martial arts, which people are much more familiar with now, where there isn't a very strong dividing line between philosophy and religion in the first place. And then there isn't a strong dividing line between philosophy, religion, and martial arts, such that your martial arts could be viewed as sort of a path to enlightenment, depending on which martial art you were doing. So in Japan, where they've had martial arts for a long time and war for a long time, they had very long, violent period there. And they developed martial techniques, as they call them. So the Japanese have two terms for martial arts: martial technique and martial way. And the traditional martial arts were called martial techniques, and that was pre 1868, the Meiji Restoration. And in those martial techniques, the goal was effectively to efficiently kill or incapacitate your opponent. So traditional jujitsu was taught in order to have a lightly armed fighter take out a heavily armed and armored opponent. For instance, a samurai on the battlefield who lost his primary weapon, say a spear, and he only had his dagger left, taking on another samurai who had his spear and his dagger, and focusing on incapacitating and killing that other samurai despite the weapon disparity. So they had a lot of focus on grappling and throws due to the fact that you can't strike through armor. Although a dagger, once you had somebody down on the ground, you could find the weak points and kill them. So that's kind of the old school Japanese martial arts. And then the new school, which gets more into that blend of philosophy and martial arts, is what they call Budo. So, for instance, jujitsu, it was a jutsu. So that's the technique. And Budo is the way. So judo is a way, whereas jujitsu is a technique. Although this does not apply to anything outside of Japan because is Japanese naming autism at play. So after 1886 or 1868, the Japanese started focusing on martial arts that were a lifestyle rather than a way to kill somebody. And they had the side benefit of being applicable in self-defense situations, but that was not the main purpose of the martial arts. So with judo, it was initially founded by a fairly intellectual individual. I'm not sure how wealthy he was, but he was reading the classics and learning English, and he was in a school that involved bullying, so he wanted to get some martial techniques and beat up some bullies. But it was very difficult to find martial arts trainers due to the fact that it had gone out of vogue in the new era of peace of the Meiji Restoration. But eventually found some martial arts trainers, learned jiu-jitsu, and then what he did was take out the techniques that were weapons focused and focus more on takedowns, unarmed opponents fighting unarmed opponents, and pretty much codify a system of fighting that was, there were very few rules. They're just, the situation was different now that it was unarmed versus unarmed. And that new form that he called judo, because he incorporated his philosophical teachings into the actual martial art, making it what the Japanese call martial way, managed to defeat the challenging jiu-jitsu schools that were also trying to revolutionize, which caused the traditional schools to either double down on their traditionalism and, stick their head in the sand, or respond to judo and incorporate techniques from judo or incorporate techniques to deal with judo techniques. So it transformed the landscape of the Japanese martial arts scene. And an interesting aspect of judo is that it was the first martial art to incorporate the now ubiquitous gi and belting system. So it's, I don't know what the term would be, but that influence is just transformative on the martial arts scene in general, because karate came around a little later than judo, and it had a similar lifestyle aspect to it, except a stronger focus on the lifestyle. And in the early days of karate, up until 1940, it was still occurring that people would be kicked out of dojos for sparring because karate was so focused on lifestyle. The direct quote being, "The aim of karate lays not in victory or defeat, but in perfection of the character of its participants." But after 1940, they started taking up sparring and being more interested in competition. And in the current day, it is very, very competitive. Both judo and karate are in the Olympics, but it's a point-based system, so it's not full contact sparring. And Kyokushin karate, which came around in 1957, was the first full contact karate, which was designed to actually fight. And their competitors would spar in a competition with full contact, bare knuckles, and a knockout to victory. So I think that sums up just an intro there to the Japanese. And then that judo and jiu-jitsu, which had been informed by judo, really took off around the entire world in around the early 1900s. And that led to things such as BJJ.
Yeah, I guess I can jump in there from that point, because it seemed like there was like the 1904 1905 Russian-Japanese war, and Japan won, which was like very unexpected, and it really raised like the Japanese profile internationally, especially like around their like martial tradition, right? Like it was a big victory for them and elevated like the way that they had done their military preparation and that kind of thing, which incorporated these martial arts. So it was popular for Japanese martial artists to go abroad at this point, like in the wake of the war, and teach. And there was like a fairly reasonable demand from various countries for Japanese trainers for their police force and militaries. And I think the most influential one in the present era is definitely Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Probably most people have heard of it. And that essentially was started by one family, the Gracies. And it all started when a group of Japanese Jiu-Jitsu judo practitioners, the word was kind of, as Price was saying, there was like inter-exchange between Jiu-Jitsu and judo. But they were more or less judo practitioners that they went to Brazil to do basically like challenge fights and prize fights in various cities, and also training for military cadets and police cadets. And the head guy, this guy named Mitsuyo Beda, which I'm going to butcher all these Japanese names if I have to keep using them, but I think he went by Conde Koma. He's better known as Conde Koma. He was like the main guy, and he opened up a dojo gym, and the first Gracie, Gaston, I think is how you say it in Portuguese.
I struggle every day with those. I try not to just say them, just avoid it.
So Gaston, he was like a Scottish Brazilian businessman. He hired the Coma for basically show matches in the Amazon. So he was like a Amazonian business person. He wanted like these show matches to like keep people entertained and keep them from going revolting, essentially. And his son, Carlos Gracie, was about 15 at the time, and he joined the dojo and started training. And he trained there for about 3 years. And then he moved to Rio de Janeiro, where he started his own sessions training people. And he also trained with his brothers. Like he had, I think, 4 brothers that he trained with at home. And he read jiu-jitsu books and judo books that he could get his hands on. And basically tried to perfect his craft, and eventually opening like a jiu-jitsu school of his own. Actually taking over a jiu-jitsu school from someone he knew, who he had a disagreement with, and that person basically just gave up and gave him the jiu-jitsu gym. He also worked with a bunch of other practitioners in Brazil, because there was a lot, like Brazil had the biggest Japanese expat population in the world, and they had a lot of martial artists that had gone there to train.
Still is the second most Japanese-speaking country on Earth after Japan.
Yeah, so there was a lot of like other not just Gracie people that he worked with, and he started to do challenge matches as well, and fought another Japanese person who was trained in judo and catch wrestling, which was like basically a freestyle wrestling uh, that had submissions and other stuff. And I guess the interesting thing about Brazilian Jiu Jitsu in the beginning was that the Gracies emphasized fighting from bottom and fighting from the ground, because a lot of the people that they fought were judo masters who were much better at takedowns than they were. And so they would always get taken down pretty much. Like some of the matches, they'd be taken down multiple or like a dozen times by the judo masters, and they just couldn't keep up with them in terms of takedowns and takedown defenses. So they just decided that they would fight from the ground. Like once it got on the ground, then they would develop a system to go on the offense when they were in the bottom position, hold the opponent in bottom position, and fight from the bottom position. And it was very effective. They were able to actually, most fights were actually draws. They didn't really have a scoring system the same way that modern martial arts are scored. So I think it was like basically submission or knockout, more or less.
Has gone ended.
Yeah, so it was like much less rules and like much more just like go until someone gives up. And so most of them are draws, but they still did have a positive win to loss ratio beyond the draws. And yeah, they obviously they continue to develop the sport and increase its popularity. And then there was like a million Gracie descendants that spread it everywhere, because most of the Gracies were started in training in what came to be known as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, at a very young age, and lots of them became very good and very proficient, and then moved all over the world. I think there's a couple interesting things to further note about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Is like one, that because the original person that had taught Carlos, the Conde Coma guy, he was like very non-traditional in terms of judo. He didn't give a shit about any of the like the way stuff, like the spiritual stuff. Because in fact, like because he participated in prize fights and prize fighting, he was like a black sheep in the community, in the judo community, because that was like explicitly forbidden by judo. You weren't supposed to prize fight. And like the whole belting system, he didn't really care about. None of that stuff really mattered to him. It's like much more just about the actual fighting and proving that he was the best fighter, and didn't really, as far as I can see, didn't really care much about that. The rest of the spiritual aspect stuff and philosophy and all this stuff. So it was just much more practical fighting technique, and reigned supreme for him. And that like really influenced the Gracies. They didn't really get involved in much of the spiritual stuff. They just like focused on kind of low or no rules fighting, what worked best. And then just a couple more things to add. As Price was saying, like judo definitely developed past, like on its own track, in parallel with jiu-jitsu, and it really went like in a much more sports direction. And there was like a big push in the early to mid 1900s to like clean it up and add a bunch of rules to make it sports ready, because they wanted it added to the Olympics, which it was in the 1960s.
Well, that's a good place to add. A lot of people now, you obviously associate judo with throws if you think of judo, but initially there was quite a bit of groundwork, and that was trimmed because it was considered uninteresting to watch for spectators.
Yeah, and I was just mentioning that. I was mentioning that because like the judo and the jiu-jitsu that was taught to start Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is quite different from like modern judo. Modern judo does still have some overlap, but yeah, it lost a lot of the ground game, and it emphasized kind of no expert, but like more like complicated throwing techniques versus kind of down and dirty kind of wrestling and just straightforward takedowns that were a bit more, say, practical in a low rule setting, right? Like the less rules there are, the more kind of you just do whatever works. And as rules were introduced, things got a little bit more complex and complicated as you could, you had to refine your technique to follow the specific rules and, especially the point scoring system and all that kind of thing. So modern judo is not really analogous to what was exported out of Japan in the early 1900s. And similarly, I think there's a similar kind of parallel with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is it Federation or Foundation, which does like the sports side of Jiu-Jitsu. There's a lot of rules that came in with that, and that was founded in 1994. And so there's like a lot of sports specific Jiu-Jitsu rules that have changed kind of how jiu-jitsu is practiced and looks compared to the jiu-jitsu that you would have seen in, say, 1930s Japan, or sorry, 1930s Brazil. So it kind of parallel processes there where there was a lot of shifts and changes in the sport that would make it hard to recognize.
The thing I find interesting with the sporterization of Brazilian jiu-jitsu that I imagine early judo would have loved to have the opportunity for is television and modern camera work. Like there are people who just love to watch the ground game of two people going at it with jiu-jitsu or wrestling or anything like that. And you just couldn't have seen that in the early 1900s. But now you can have the camera just zoomed right up and you see exactly what they're doing to each other.
That definitely makes much easier popularize the sport, but it also makes it easier to like review what the hell's going on.
Yeah, that's another good point. Like I sort of accelerate the development now with like recording and rewatching your fights.
Yeah. So beyond Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's Sambo, which is Russian, which was also inspired right around the same time as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in similar way where Japanese, it was a Russian who had been stationed in Japan who learned judo / Japanese jiu-jitsu, and then he brought it back to Russia along with another practitioner and a student. There's like the three of them are considered the founders, and it was like made to be a military combat, hand-to-hand combat style that was based in Japanese jiu-jitsu, but incorporated some other martial arts and other techniques and kind of developed on its own trajectory and path, and is still, I think it's even getting more popular today as well, along with Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but it's its own separate martial art for sure, and it has its own particularities, and like I said, getting quite popular.
Well, I think might be a good spot to jump into a bit of Chinese martial arts because of the similarity here in that Sambo was developed for the use by the army in Russia. And Chinese martial arts, well, they have a very long and mysterious history. As far as I could tell, there's not a very good record of Chinese martial arts until about the early 1900s during the Chinese Republic, where they actually got a government initiative to try and figure out what the hell was going on with all the martial arts in China. And then they got an army focus group together to develop an effective martial art that they could codify and teach people. And so that was what the government would call wushu, or at least once the communists took over, they called it wushu. I couldn't see if it was called something different under the Republicans. And so the Communist Party pushed wushu as the only martial art for quite a few years in China and attempted to suppress the other ones until about the 70s or 80s. And wushu has I don't know if the correct term is sub-discipline, but the discipline of wushu that focuses on what we'd consider MMA in the West is called Sanda. And in Sanda, there is anything. Initially, it was anything goes, and it was basically a military style how to defeat your opponent in a no holds barred match. And then that has also been sporterized, but in this case by the Chinese Communist Party in order to popularize it with the people. And they've removed some of the ground game. But interestingly, there is a monastery of sorts or a boarding school in Russia that teaches Sanda and has had one or two students go to the UFC and perform quite well. And they've also been I believe the first non-Chinese to win the World Wushu competitions. And that boarding school is almost what people think the ancient Chinese martial arts are, but I don't think I've seen any evidence that they've ever were like this. But this boarding school in Dagestan in Russia focuses on teaching the classics and moral and philosophical education of their students, while also being very focused on teaching martial arts and very successful at teaching effective martial arts, as demonstrated by having students make it into the UFC. And interestingly, Dagestan may just be a hotbed of martial arts because 2% of Russians are from Dagestan, but 7 of the 10 Russian fighters in the UFC are from Dagestan. So there's an interesting martial culture there, and there's definitely still that aspect of teaching a philosophical and almost religious approach to life that often seems to not agree with success in sporting martial arts, but they've made it work with the Sanda, it seems like.
Yeah, I think for the Chinese martial arts, like you were saying, it is very mysterious prior to like the 1900s. But I think like Sanda is not what anyone in the Western world that has a stereotypical view of Chinese martial arts would think of at all. Like it's like completely opposite. Like
I hadn't even heard of it until researching for this, because I was like, what do the Chinese actually do? Because they do call, like people call Chinese martial arts kung fu, and when I looked that up, it said this is just basically a broad term for getting good at something, like developing an expertise. So like kung fu can be properly applied to, as far as I understand, kung fu can properly be applied to every martial art in China, regardless of what is actually going on in that martial art.
Yeah, but I do think like the Shaolin monks are like one of the cultural like icons of Chinese martial arts, and they practiced kung fu as far as I know. And yes, kung fu I think can be applied to anything. It can even be applied to like knitting. If you intensely develop your knitting skills, it could be your kung fu could be knitting. But from what I was understanding, the Shaolin monks, their kung fu is they do like a Buddhist meditation spiritual side, and then they also have a kung fu in martial arts training, and that kung fu is like your classic Western understanding of Chinese martial arts, where it's forms based with animal like analogies, where there's various schools or sub disciplines of the kung fu with like the bear style or whatever the
crane stance.
Yeah, and that it's like literally a thing in like the Shaolin arts. And then you also have a bunch of like offshoots. I think like that was like the backbone of like somewhat recent Chinese martial arts was like the Shaolin monks. But then you have like a bunch of offshoots of that, and you have like the other one that's really well known in the West, I think. Well, not Wing Chun is quite well known because there's that movie series IP Man, which is he does Wing Chun, and that's again an offshoot of like some sort of more ancient Chinese kung fu, like Shaolin style with forms and stuff. And yeah, from what I could tell is a lot of the Chinese, like traditional, quote unquote, traditional Chinese martial arts focused around striking rather than grappling, which is like distinct from Japan, which was as Price was saying before, was mostly grappling because you can't really strike through armor, whereas China was like always based around striking, or mostly based around striking in these.
Well, if you manage your ki correctly, you can punch right through that armor. You just got to channel your ki into your.
You don't even need to punch. You just flick your hand and they fly away. Those are my favorite ones.
Yeah, so I think that would be like the martial arts that people would be most familiar with China, is like this Shaolin monk style. And
the stuff you would have saw in like the old like martial art movies that came out in like the 70s and 80s.
They call them wuxia films, I believe, and the Republican government really didn't like them because they thought it was glorifying violence or something along those lines. And then I think they were also cracked down upon by the communists, but they were just so popular, even within China, let alone in the rest of the world, that you just couldn't stop them. People loved them.
Well, and there was a period in the early 1900s where like the Republican Chinese government was like promoting that traditional Shaolin monk kung fu stuff as a point of like patriotic pride to the rest of the world, which is again why that's like such a iconic thing in like the Westerner perception of like Chinese martial arts, is because there's like this period where that was essentially what they were pushing as like, and then it led to kind of like a proliferation of these schools outside of China for like Wing Chun and Kung Fu and stuff. And I like, as far as I think Sanda is quite rare outside of China, whereas like you actually have a huge amount of like Wing Chun schools in other countries.
I think the interesting thing in Chinese martial arts, they make the distinction between internal and external. And internal styles are focused on ki manipulation, like basically life energy, and meditate and develop your abilities spiritually. And then external are focused on improving muscular and cardiovascular fitness, which is much more what people think with Western martial arts. But it's those internal ones, like we're kind of discussing now, that just caught on like wildfire in the Western world, because people want, like, that's what, it's just so mysterious, or like fills that void of religion maybe even in some of the Western world, as opposed to like Sanda's not going to be very different than going and doing MMA, right? Like it's just another form of fighting with no holds barred, like trying to get in shape and figure out counters, and doesn't have that spiritual deepness.
Yeah, guys, I forgot one of the quintessential internal martial art is Tai Chi.
Oh yeah.
And which is like a lot of people like don't even practice it really as like a martial arts anymore in the West, but it's still practiced. It's almost like yogic, and it's
I would like, equate that like far more closely to yoga than it would
that is the definition of an internal martial art in China. Like that is the far end of internal, I would say.
And it's pushed as an internal martial arts. Like that is what it was founded as and pushed as.
I don't think it was ever put up as a combat martial art.
Well, it was like the problem with all these internal martial arts is all the masters and expert practitioners push them as legitimate combat martial arts. They just say that they're too deadly to demonstrate.
Yeah, that certainly is.
Tai Chi, like there's tons of Tai Chi practitioners that will say, yes, I'm a master at this. Yes, I could kill you, but I don't want to kill you.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Like I guess in the popular culture of the West, I don't think it was ever really thought of as, or at least in the last quite a long time, because I remember hearing about it and it was always seen as like a much more yogic centered
I think the
practice.
Thing that killed it in the West, I think it was probably popularly seen in the same way as like, oh, these people could kill you with a flick of their finger, until you got into MMA and other televised martial arts. But MMA being the big one, UFC.
Yeah, that basically killed all of those martial arts.
Yeah, if an internal martial artist showed up to UFC, they were going to die.
Well, it's interesting. There's a man in China who's an MMA fighter, and he goes around just kicking the ever living shit out of these masters of any sort of traditional like internal one. Uh, if a master of one of these internal ones puts out a proclamation basically saying that like my school and my is the most effective martial art in the world, and I can basically beat everybody. He challenges them, and if they accept, he will meet them, and they'll fight. And he's recorded a bunch of these fights, and it's just him pummeling these guys into oblivion. And he's gotten himself in huge trouble with the Chinese government. He's got his social credit score reduced to basically zero, so he can't fly in a plane, he can't use a whole bunch of services, and he just keeps doing it. He doesn't care. I think he's still going. But
well, I think it's interesting because you were saying like, yeah, it was like promoted as like a more yogic. I think that's true. Like Price was saying, in the last like 2 or 3 decades. But
yeah, so maybe when I like from
when
just the pop culture around like when I was around. But
prior to that, I think you had a long period of time when these various Eastern martial arts were considered like potentially legitimate combat, styles that you could actually, ninja your way into, one punching someone or, one tapping someone with
you're gonna be the
ease.
deadliest guy at the bar if you master it.
Bruce Lee would be a good example of playing up that stereotype, because what was his thing, the 1-inch punch or something?
Well, and even he like created his own martial arts.
Yeah, he pulled from various disciplines.
But he absolutely like exploited the Western love of like thinking that there's this super secret techniques that are only known to the mystics, and like he trained in China, so he knows them or whatever.
And I think that mystique didn't really fade strongly until the 90s and even 2000s, especially when the rubber met the road in mixed martial arts, whereas like you bring whatever you want to the table and you get in a ring and you see what happens, and bad stuff happened, right? Like all these supposed
BJJ wound up dominating.
Well, there was. I mean, we can go into the various ones that have done well, but yeah, like there was a handful.
BJJ was like dominating in terms of being very popularly practiced.
Well, it came in like the BJJ practitioners came into the UFC and started dominating.
But almost everyone who does BJJ also has a striking martial art, do they not?
Now, when the UFC first started, it was guys would come in and they'd typically be a single art practitioner. Sometimes they'd have wrestling and some punching, right? And that was it. And then the BJJ guys came in and they started smoking people. And then
I think Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, even back in the day, did teach how to incorporate like handling strikes into their
just so they wouldn't
training.
Get lit up.
And again, that's where like there was a divergence with like the sport Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under like the International Federation, which was like pure Jiu-Jitsu, and you weren't doing it in an MMA context, diverged slightly, not a ton, but it did diverge slightly from like Gracie Jiu-Jitsu that went on to like get incorporated into MMA, because the sport one, obviously you're only against other Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, there's no striking, and therefore you don't even need to know how to handle striking. So there is like differences where you would put yourself in a particular situation in straight Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that you would never have considered in, say, like the original Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, where they knew you could get your face pounded in.
Yeah. So, from what you were saying, they like in that original format, like there was very little rules, right? So you could still get punched or kicked in the head.
Yeah, I think it depended on the particular, like, because a lot
on the
of
actual
these,
tournament
like,
itself.
the show matches and challenge matches, it wasn't like there was some regulating body. Just like you guys met up, came to an agreement what was and wasn't allowed, and then let it rip, right? So like there was never a lot of these things never had like defined borders on like the various uh rules, right? And even like Japanese jiu-jitsu incorporated various rule sets in competition when they were like compete like the original, because there was like a round of original jiu-jitsu competitions in Japan, and there was like a lot of deaths because there's just like no rules, kind of like challenge matches, and they just like people would die, and then they started bringing in some more rules, which like just like so that people wouldn't die as much. So it like kind of changed the practices of jiu-jitsu in
Soften
Japan.
it up.
Prior to exporting to this, I think this was a period prior to exporting it to most of the world, because the challenge matches were leading to too many deaths because there's not enough like, I guess like quote unquote common sense rules on like, oh yeah, you can't just like neck slam them to death.
Stomp on their head.
So, but yeah, like I was saying, for jiu-jitsu coming into the MMA, I don't think it was like pure grappling in that sense as much as we'd consider like I was saying, if you watched a modern jiu-jitsu say championship, it would look probably not a huge amount different, but a bit different than what would have been practiced by people coming into the MMA who had a jiu-jitsu background.
Well, the other thing, obviously, if you're reaching that level, you've been training for probably at least 20 years, maybe 10, I don't know. But you'd be lagging, like your practitioners would be lagging the changes in the sports by a bit as well.
Yeah, that's true too. And again, like a lot of these people did cross train with other things. You know, like I was saying before, even the Gracies, when they had people coming in that had like catch wrestling and boxing backgrounds and other types of, you know, martial arts trainings that got incorporated to some degree or another into the practices and techniques. I don't know where we wound up on our history.
I think we got a pretty good foundation. I guess another good one to add in is sort of in the latter half of the 20th century, there was a boom in what would you want to call it, like combination martial arts, where people would pick and choose from the martial arts that were popular. So one of the instances I found of this that was very early was Taiho Jutsu, which was developed by the Japanese police in 1947 because Americans banned the practice of martial arts in Japan between 1945 and 1950. So the police had to come up with a new training regimen, which I don't know how they slipped this one by the Americans, but they basically just took aspects of jiu-jitsu, karate, kendo, and judo, and then they threw in a bit of Western boxing, and they called that definitely not a martial art. This is just police training. And that's still the martial art that the Japanese police use today, although they do work on updating it. An interesting part of that martial art is that kendo is sword fighting, and I'd imagine that was incorporated because it teaches both bare hands and the utilization of batons and staffs, because in Japan, the riot police use staffs to control the crowds. So there's a little more than just barehanded. And another interesting one that sounds like it's kind of become a meme in the Western world is Krav Maga, which is very similar, where a expert martial artist took various parts that worked from various schools and fused them together to create a martial art specifically for the Israeli military that could be taught effectively and efficiently to conscripts, so that you basically weren't wasting a bunch of time with trivial stuff like philosophy or, you know, moves that only work in a sporting situation. But it sounds like that in the Western world, Krav Maga gyms are very mediocre at best.
Yeah, we can touch on that a little bit. I've seen some, yeah, not so glowing reviews of Krav Maga as it's practiced. I think the theory is maybe not terrible, but the practice seems to be lacking. I think there's we did miss a few important ones that might be worth covering. One is it's kind of a I hadn't heard of it before looking. It's Coparia,
Capoeira.
Capoeira,
Capoeira. Capoeira, yeah, that's dance
It's
fighting. I think it's a Brazilian one, is it not?
yeah, it's so it was like Japanese or no, Japanese, Brazilian slaves, like descent African descended Brazilian slaves came up with this like yeah, it's like a like you said dance martial art. I saw a few videos. It looks interesting, and apparently it's very uh, S S plus tier for difficulty. Very hard to like do these like jumping spin kicks and interesting things. It doesn't seem to translate very well into actual fighting capability in something like a mixed martial arts or self defense scenario, but it looks fun, I
Looks
guess.
cool.
Yeah, and the other one that, or another one, obviously that is very useful is Muay Thai, which
Oh yeah.
basically seems to come down from somewhere in the 16th century in Thailand, and it was like practiced in the military, and it's become like the national sport of Thailand and like borderline obsession, and it's basically kickboxing with knees, elbows, and clinch fighting. So like you can like grab necks and clinch and do clinch fighting. So it's like pretty comprehensive in terms of striking, but also has like a little bit of grappling with the clinching techniques. So it's actually one of the most utilized uh, martial arts in modern MMA and other areas, just because it's very and there's tons of it has a huge following and a lot of competition, so it's no bullshit. Like there's tons of sparring in it that's very well tested. It's yeah, so it seems to be one of the most popular striking sports for anyone looking for like a mixed martial arts career. Yeah, you touched on Krav Maga. Is there any just trying oh I think it's worth also just talking about like wrestling, which
Oh yeah, we didn't go into wrestling much, but wrestling is surprisingly strong in all situations.
yeah, and there's like two probably larger schools of wrestling that people have heard of. There's Greco-Roman, which the big difference between Greco-Roman and then the other styles is that you can't do below the waist holds. So you can't like grab legs and hold legs in, and that like really changes the dynamics. Apparently, I'm not a wrestler, but apparently that you can imagine that it would have a very big change in dynamic when you can't go for leg grabs and like versus being able to. And then the other one is called freestyle wrestling, which you can go for leg grabs and leg holds below the waist holds, and that's a version of freestyle is what is also done for collegiate and scholastic, so like high school and college level wrestling in the US, which is very popular, is a version of freestyle, although there's like scoring differences and rule differences, but it's kind of like a version of freestyle. And that I was also talking about catch wrestling before, which is like a precursor to freestyle wrestling, and it's kind of like it has like submissions and joint locks and various other techniques that are allowed on top of like being the wrestling. So it's kind of like a more comprehensive or more loose rule based wrestling that was developed in the United Kingdom. And just like for historical context, Greco-Roman became very popular in Europe on the continental Europe, and freestyle wrestling of one version or another dominates the United Kingdom and the United States. So there's as far as I know, there's basically no Greco-Roman popularity in the U.S. So I think when you see like wrestling mentioned in a lot of things, like people talking about wrestling for like martial arts, mixed martial arts, most people are talking about freestyle wrestling as like practice more or less in the United States.
Well, and especially for mixed martial arts, because that ban on the leg grabs is just such a detriment to your. If that ban's removed, all your techniques are going to be different.
Yeah, and because you can obviously do leg grabs in mixed martial arts, you just you have a huge hole in your game for if you're Greco-Roman. But yeah, the wrestling has also proved very effective for as a martial arts, and I mean, some version of wrestling has been popular in I think almost every part of the world at some point in time.
I had a philosophy or psychology professor who was talking about sort of the joke about Shaolin monks showing up to the MMA and destroying everybody. And he said he didn't believe it because, once they started fighting like monkeys in there, they were already approaching peak human potential, which would be wrestling or BJJ, grappling, generally speaking, very natural for humans.
Yeah. I think, did we miss any popular ones? I think.
Well, I mean, it might bear mentioning, but like Taekwondo is one that a lot of people have heard of. A relatively recent Korean martial art. I think it was codified in the early 1900s. But it seems like that one is very guilty of being sporterized, reducing its effectiveness in MMA or self-defense.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could just jump full into just analyzing them and giving our armchair analysis
I've
of
got
everything.
one last one to throw in here before we do that, though, and which is the greatest martial art. You've probably never heard of it because it's kept secret. It's only known in the UK. It's called
Concealed carry?
It's called shin kicking. Wherein two contestants attempt to kick each other in the shin in order to force their opponent to the ground.
That sound is like cheese wheel chasing.
It's like the antithesis of Tai Chi. There's
booting each other in the
no
shins.
brain, head empty.
Man, there's so many great UK traditions and sports that you've never heard of. It's just ridiculous.
Shin kicking. Good God.
It's like slap fighting.
And wasn't there something on slaps and like they're just giving people brain damage at this point because they're
hitting each other so hard?
Professionals to slap each other as hard as they can.
Yeah. There's a sport called I don't know. Yeah,
it's something slap. Yeah, it's like slap fighting,
and you just slap the person as hard as you can, and then they get to go back. I really think there's a first mover advantage in that sport. Like I don't know if you even. It's like I'm gonna go ahead and go first on this one, guys. Like. I don't know how someone who's like basically knocked out and can barely stand is going to get a good slap back, but yeah. I don't know. Oh, there's also
that's why you'll never be champion. You just don't get
jiu-jitsu. Apparently, Russians, obviously Russians, decided that they were going to basically hold Brazilian jiu-jitsu matches, but you start in the passenger and driver's seat of a car.
That's actually sick.
And you just fight jiu-jitsu in a car, and there's like
of course it's Russian.
Roof. And I don't really understand it, but I've seen a couple of matches on YouTube of car jiu-jitsu, and it's leaked outside of Russia now.
It's going to turn into a TikTok trend.
Oh, there's also a thing where another Russian one where you just there's about 500 people on either side with boxing gloves. And then you just go to war, like on a field. You just 500 versus 500. You just go until everyone's down or given up on trying to be alive anymore. And
the Russians have it figured.
It's just man. I don't know. So I don't know if that one's gonna make any waves on the MMA world, but it exists. Yeah, it's just crazy.
All the fun shit comes out of Russia. That's what I'm learning.
Yeah, I think we could give our armchair analysis of the different ones as far as we understand them or we looked into them.
Mm-hmm.
There's another. Yeah, I mean, we can bring up the other ones, but I don't know. I don't know. It seems like there is a kind of a consensus, though, at this point, just given how much uh, exchange between the different uh, martial arts schools has gone on. Like, it's been long enough of like there being mixed martial arts as a thing and enough money that if there was any, secret sauce, someone would have come forward from, any of one of those given schools to like, you know,
Yeah, they would just come out and dominate.
yeah, like if there was some hidden, Shaolin monk style, whatever, that really is insanely good, it would have made its way out of the woodwork and into the, MMA ring, and the fighter would be fighting for millions of dollars if it really was effective. So I think we've reached a point in time where it is kind of possible to assess the different ones.
So what are your armchair analyses of these?
Well, I think it's worth distinguishing between like what you're rating them on, or like what you're looking at.
Yeah, what your criteria of success is.
Like if you're just talking mixed martial arts, it seems to be slightly different than if you're talking like self-defense. And, it's because I think for self-defense, what I kind of saw was the big difference between self-defense and like something like mixed martial arts is like in MMA, you're going to know that you're fighting. You're going to have space and time before the match starts. You're going to start standing up, at a distance from your opponent. You're going to be able to control those variables. You're going to be able to come into it and kind of know what's going on. And that leads that emphasizes different skills and attributes than self-defense situations. Like I was listening to Jocko Willink, the Navy SEAL, and he explained it pretty, I think, straightforwardly. It's like if you're in a self-defense situation, your first line of defense is just leaving, like running away. And if you can, so that his, I guess, logic for emphasizing grappling over striking arts for self-defense is that if you're just in kind of enough of a distance to like striking being the determining factor, you should just leave. You should just walk away. Like it's not, if you're 20 feet away from each other and you're gonna go square up with someone, don't square up. Leave. It's not worth it. The one situation where that's not possible and you can't leave is when someone grabs you or is like so close to you that blocks your path or whatever. Then you're going to be in a situation where it's going to basically start in a grappling situation. So for self-defense, I think the logic there is you'd want some sort of grappling training, which would be put jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and like wrestling essentially at the top, and to a lesser extent judo. And then, you may want you probably want some sort of striking assistance in case there was a situation where it started as a striking match or there was strikes being thrown, just to know what you're doing and not be completely off guard. And I think the other logic there is the amount of knowledge. Like I was listening to one self-defense expert explain it, like the amount of knowledge you need in grappling to take someone down is a lot lower than the amount of knowledge you need in striking to keep the fight standing. So if you only know how to do striking, it's actually, you need to be like pretty much a complete expert to keep the fight in a standing position if the other person knows some degree of grappling. Whereas with grappling, you don't need to know a ton to get the fight to on the ground in a grappling situation against even like a somewhat experienced striker. You just charge them, do some sort of takedown, and it's turned into a grappling situation.
You're gonna have to eat 2 or 3 strikes maybe, but then all of a sudden they're on the ground, and that's your element.
Yeah, so and you're probably not going to even eat you could get unlucky and eat a pretty brutal one, but if you charge somebody and they don't really know how to strike properly, they have to get lucky with that
But even
strike
if
to
they
do some.
know how, like, it's just, are they gonna take you down in 1 or 2 punches?
Well, that's what he's saying. Like, you have to be an absolute expert striker to see someone charging you, and then 1 or 2
Be able to,
strikes
yeah, like
before you're even taken down to like eliminate the person as a threat. So, like he was saying, that's his logic. Is like most fights are going to end up in some sort of grappling situation, even if the people have some degree of experience, simply because most, the bar for being such an expert striker that you can end the fight before the distance close is really high. And so, yeah, if you're an absolute, world class boxer, yeah, you can probably put the guy down before anything escalates to a grapple. But that's, most people who are just doing it as a hobby, you're never going to get to that level. So you're better off starting with a grappling, because it's probably going to turn into grappling if you are in a self defense situation.
yeah, every single bar fight I've ever seen has always wound up on the ground pretty quickly.
And yeah, I don't know. The other thing that I saw a lot about like self defense in terms of how it relates to martial arts is just like a lot of the aspects of self defense that they're never going to get taught in martial arts, because it's like situational awareness and things like that, where it's just like knowing that the situation is not ideal before it happens. So there's soft skills that don't really translate into a gym situation and people aren't really willing to pay for that type of learning or training anyway.
I think one thing where like the Japanese martial way systems would sort of give an advantage to those soft skills is the focus on sort of giving you a respectful, non-confrontational attitude towards people in general.
When I was doing research on just like the scientific studies and the benefits and or weaknesses issues with martial arts, one of the things that they did find was an improvement. Like with kids, they found that those types, like the traditional, like something like Taekwondo, was pretty helpful for kids, particularly boys, to develop their pro-social behaviors. That was one study found a pretty big effect for that. So, and there was another one that also found a slight decrease in overall aggression for the participants who were doing like one that had like that level of like philosophy behind it as well. It wasn't just a flat out like here's a combat sport, hyper competitive one. One of the interesting things they actually found was, and one of the other ones, another study found that with delinquent boys, they put them either in a like a traditional Taekwondo class, a competition based one, or a like various sports. And they found that the traditional based one had improvements in overall like delinquent attitudes and behaviors, whereas the combative one, where it was more like a competition focused martial art, they wound up like with none of the underlying philosophy, they wound up showing an increase in what would I guess be called like delinquent behavior. So, rejection of authority, misbehaving, that type of stuff. And the regular sports, that group found that they had a slight increase in some other things, and then some benefits as well. But I found that to be interesting. The data around this stuff is not great. There hasn't been a ton of big studies and whatnot, but that wasn't that like to your point, Price, like that from the data that is out there that I could find, that was backed up.
Yeah, like it just makes it does make sense that your surroundings are affected by you to a certain degree, and that improving your own behavior and attitude would give you some level of benefit.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think I was discussing more like anticipating, when situations that look dangerous or whatever, which I think is slightly different. But yeah, I agree. Like your attitude could definitely help.
Yeah, I was just trying to throw in like there are some of the soft skills that I think are developed by that more attitude focus in some of the martial arts.
There are like a handful of schools that actually like train like self-defense specifically, but it seems like most people, not surprisingly, just want to do like a sports kind of based martial arts that they can compete in and have fun in, right? Like there's just not a huge demand for like going to a class where you're going to learn about, situational awareness and maybe you do a knife technique defense or whatever, and it's like people just want to show up to like a jiu-jitsu class or karate class and just do fun stuff. They don't want to. So it seems like there's a very small amount of actual dedicated self-defense courses or classes out there because there's no demand for it exclusively.
One thing, while discussing courses on self-defense, in terms of practical self-defense, is that in America there seems to be a fairly substantial culture of firearm self-defense courses. So people who teach you how to run drills like in a house with a shotgun, or how to run drills with a pistol from concealed carry, that sort of aspect, which would fall into like a weapons-based martial art. But maybe for self-defense, I don't know if that would be more popular than the sort of courses you're discussing, or if it'd be sort of an equivalent popularity, and maybe they're just overrepresented in the subset of Americans I see. But I have seen courses like that on offer from Americans.
If I was to guess, I would say that the gun-based ones would be like 50 times more popular than physical training-based ones. Like the physical training-based ones would be very boring because they're not. You don't get to get a gun and shoot stuff.
Yeah.
You get set down and talk about this is indications someone's acting aggressively. This is how you analyze like escape routes. This is how like very boring stuff. And I think for most people,
I was gonna say most people are probably gonna eyes will glaze over at that, even though it is really useful.
Whereas like you add the fun factor in of a gun, I think you just get way more of a draw, right? You have a lot of gun nuts that are just do that for like the coolness of it, right? Versus they would probably not do it if there was no gun. Like,
That's a good point.
Like it's just.
To be honest, I would do a self-defense course with a sword before I'd do a self-defense course with fists. Like having a weapon would just be a vibe.
It'd be more, I'd just add
exactly.
It's a big degree of interest in it for sure. So I do definitely think that helps. And for Americans, at least they have that option. Like,
speaking of weird martial arts, the strangest one I saw for the Japanese, which I have to assume was a very similar context of sort of self-defense with a weapon, is they had a martial art specifically for a martial technique, killing people, but it was all about a single strike, drawing your sword from its scabbard, striking once, and then returning it to its scabbard because you've killed the person. It was like the quick draw sword kill, and it was an entire martial technique.
Well, that makes sense, like samurai.
Yeah.
It's like you just train over and over again to like one shot. I guess.
But it's like that was like the samurai equivalent of Western gun duels, probably, with like the cowboys.
Yeah. So where did we end up? We were talking about
just like self-defense not being so popular.
Yeah. Well, and we're just talking about things that are arts. I think Sambo. There's like combat Sambo, which I think is another good one for self-defense because it's there's like grappling, takedowns, submissions, striking. It's like pretty comprehensive. Seems like, and the combat version is also doesn't have very many rules, which again, that's another thing that like affects the effectiveness basically of this martial art on self-defense. Is like if the main the main versions of that martial art are sports versions, there can definitely be some weird rules in the sport that basically would make it less effective or ineffective for self-defense purposes. Like going back to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, one of the things you could see for that is like pulling guard. Like if you just were in a fight and then you just like sat on your ass and like started butt scooting towards your opponent.
Yeah.
It might actually work to a degree, but I don't think that would be something you'd want to start with on a concrete surface in a self-defense situation. And that's like another reason a lot of people actually really emphasize wrestling as being excellent, because wrestling is about like getting control of your opponent and then getting their back,
and starting from like a standing position too.
Well, and then when you get them on the ground, it's about getting their back. You don't give up bottom position in wrestling, because that's not how the points are scored. You have to be on top position. So it's about controlling their back and pinning them to the ground, which is like actually in a self-defense situation quite ideal. Like you'd want to maintain top control and like pin them and like maintain that entire like control, because you know, if you're on a concrete parking lot, you don't want to get slammed on your back into guard.
Well, one of the most brutal things is if you were just looking at it from a BJJ perspective and you think you're in a decent position, then the person starts punching you in the head.
Yeah. That was one thing when I started BJJ, I was thinking about, like, just after kind of starting to understand the sport a bit more, so it just made me think that if you get into a situation where you might need to use like self-defense, and your muscle memory kicks in, you might just get punched square in the head and then you're done, because you're putting yourself in a situation that, you know, is advantageous in the sport, but when somebody can just start wailing on you with their fists, you know.
Yeah, although I think like
it's better than nothing for sure.
There's a little bit of that in jiu-jitsu, but I think there's not a lot of time that you would actually, if you're doing jiu-jitsu right, where you're actually just letting them sit in a striking position, or if they are in a striking position where you've like no recourse to moving them out of that position. Like every position,
well, you definitely have like the recourse to move them, but it's just you'd be way more vulnerable given the ability to strike, as opposed to the regular sport version where they can't strike.
Yeah, and that was also something I did see people talk about for self-defense, and they were saying like there's quite a few sports or quite a few martial arts where you don't have to do much to tweak someone's like style from what they learned, say in jiu-jitsu, to really translate really well into self-defense. Like for example, with jiu-jitsu, there's probably going to be things like defending yourself from strikes, which is actually Gracie Jiu-Jitsu teaches that. They have like self-defense for versions of jiu-jitsu and classes that are like self-defense specific, that incorporate striking and defending against striking, which is all you really need for. And same with wrestling. Like wrestling has similar weaknesses, but they can be quickly compensated for with not much of a tweak. So I think then that's grappling. I think then you have like judo for takedowns is also very useful. And then like I said before, having a striking base of any kind is like boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, any of those ones obviously going to help you. And that would also solve your problem with like if you had grappling and striking. It's quite good, because then your instincts are probably going to be attuned to both.
Yeah. I think one thing, I don't know if this is accurate, but it just feels like this from my brief look into things, is that there seems to be more acceptance of sort of cross training. Like a person will have maybe 2 black belts and they'll cross trained in a third martial art or something, as opposed to what I was saying with like the late 20th century, where everyone was trying to incorporate one ultimate martial art and take everything good from other martial arts and make a new martial art. Like, it just seems to be the case that in a lot of cases, at least, people just practice multiple martial arts for different skill sets instead of trying to meld them all together.
Yeah, I think the way that it works for MMA camps is they'll have different coaches in there, and they'll bring in like a coach who is really skilled in one particular area, and then get trained up on that. Mm-hmm. They're not trying to blend it into one and then run the camp as here's how we teach it. Like, it's one trainer that has all the knowledge, for all these different things. Like typically they just bring in experts in various fields.
Well, that is an interesting parallel between like MMA and self defense. Is like I think the almost the ideal for both is you have one thing that you're exceptional at, and then you're good enough at everything else to like funnel the person into the one thing you're good at, right? So if you're an expert in grappling, you want to be good enough at striking and takedown defense that you can get it into a grappling situation. Like you can survive the other areas of fighting. There's only like really three areas of like hand-to-hand combat where it's like your strikes, your like takedown defense, and then your grappling. It's really all there essentially is. And so if you're good enough at two of them that you can get it to the third, then and that I think translates to both MMA and self-defense, although slightly probably different.
Yeah.
MMA actually has rules still.
Well, I mean, the other thing with self-defense is that in many cases, you're just going to be so much better off if you know a martial art than if you didn't.
Well, that was like a big point of people's too, yeah.
Yeah, like if you're a black belt in anything, you're probably already ahead of 99% of the population, even though you might not be as competent at either grappling or striking, like whatever you're a black belt in. But
Okay, let's not say anything. Like Aikido, no.
Fair. I didn't actually research much into Aikido.
It's terrible. And yeah, I think any, obviously you get fitness benefits. For self-defense, the heuristic I saw in terms of like determining whether or not there was anything beyond a marginal benefit for self-defense for the martial art is whether or not they pressure tested your technique. So if you're not like actually somewhat full speed sparring in your chosen martial art, then it's probably just kind of for funsies and not actually going to translate at all into self-defense.
And that's another huge advantage to grappling, because grappling is so much safer for doing that sort of full pressure testing.
Yeah. So if you're doing sparring with some sort of striking sport, it's a pretty good chance that you're going to pick up some CTE as you go along. Like I've definitely gotten a headache from BJJ just getting slammed on the mat, but that only happened once. Whereas I feel like I haven't done the actual
like
sparring.
They're targeting your head.
Yeah, exactly. Like I don't do the striking ones for that reason. Though I might join up and do a little bit of it, but just reading about it the risk definitely seems quite a bit higher. And at BJJ, yeah, you can go full tilt and not be too worried about it, so long as you're not being ridiculous and not tapping when you get stuck in a pretty bad spot and you get something snapped.
I mean, the thing with striking is, depending on how into it you are, you turn that risk of concussion problems into a certainty.
Yeah.
Like if you get really into boxing and you're going into boxing matches all the time, you will get CTE, and it'll degrade your quality of life when you're older.
I think, yeah, it depends. Like if you do boxing as a hobbyist and you don't like go that crazy in sparring, and you wear the thick training gloves and a training helmet, you could probably minimize it to a point that it's not that.
Yeah, it can be an acceptable risk for most people, for sure.
Yeah, but going back to the point of like pressure testing, I think that's like boxing is a good example. It's a pretty good martial art to learn for self-defense because you actually spar a lot. It's like, from what I was seeing, you can get like somewhat proficient with punching within a few months of starting boxing, and that just helps you, right? Like it's a decent skill to have, knowing how to punch properly, and doesn't take that long. And it seems like you have like your arts that are basically guaranteed to come along with pressure testing. That seems like jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, boxing, kickboxing. Those seem to be kind of like the gold standard of like wrestling's a huge one. Like if for some reason your school is not doing like kind of high tempo sparring in one of those sports, you probably got like the very shitty school, that the rare exception. And then on the flip side, there's like the sports that are like the exception is the ones that actually do sparring, which seems to be like a big criticism of like Taekwondo, like you were saying before. There is apparently there is like Taekwondo schools that go pretty hard with sparring and like full tilt, and they teach like the strikes to a degree where you actually do, you know, hit people and stuff, and they can actually be pretty decent in terms of training people how to strike. But your default is going to be a school that basically doesn't do any of that. And same with karate, though it seems like karate's like shifted a little bit towards more like 50-50.
Kyokushin has really become popular, and I believe there's been quite a few offshoots now that are branded under the term full contact karate to separate them from the rest of karate.
Yeah, it seems like karate has definitely taken a few steps towards having more sparring, but again, a lot of there's a lot of McDojos in karate still where you're just you know doing
we went to one as kids.
Shadow boxing and whatever the routines are. I don't even remember what the routines are called.
I did Kyokushin as a kid because I was in the real karate, and that's the one where the founder just went around fighting anybody and everybody, and no holds barred, anything goes fights, as well as fighting bulls and killing them with his punches.
I think there's Machido boxing or Machido karate, like Lyoto, the ex-MMA star, I think started a series of schools that teaches karate as well, that apparently is quite good, like rated very well. Also does a lot of full contact
anything
sparring.
Lyoto does is probably going to be pretty good, and would be. I couldn't imagine him doing non-contact.
And going back to Krav Maga, because Price was talking about it earlier, that's like the huge criticism of Krav Maga is like they do not ever do sparring with resisting opponent at full speed. And that's like, there is a handful of schools apparently that do it now, that do some sort of full speed sparring and realistic scenarios where they actually get like dressed up in like combat or like basically football pads, and like have someone like try to knife you with a fake knife like full speed, and you have to defend against a crazed knife attacker. Which those would actually seem like pretty good and would.
That actually seems like it would work, because one of the things that if you even do something like BJJ or whatever, it's so different from learning a move in the controlled environment where the professor is teaching everybody how to do it and then actually trying to execute it on somebody. It's not even comparable. And if you don't get that, if you're not under an actual like a proper simulated situation, it's just you're not going to understand how to actually execute whatever move you're trying to do.
I'm not sure what martial art the RCMP do, or if it even has a specific martial art, but one of the guys I was talking to at my gym, and he was telling me how they use marker knives so that they'll leave a mark on you if they hit you, and then the one person tries to hit you with the knife and you have to disarm them. And he said you can take flesh wounds, like acceptable flesh wounds during the disarming, but when someone's really coming at you with a knife, and like they're obviously a fellow RCMP member, so they're in shape, like you're not going to get out of that without some cuts.
Yeah, so I think Krav Maga, again, is one of those ones where it all comes down to the variable of whether or not your particular school trains with resisting kind of high tempo pressure testing. And I would say most, like 95% of them don't really seem to. It seems because at least in like the US and Canada, Krav Maga really started to get marketed to women, like as a self-defense technique, as like, because it's like use whatever you can, like groin attacks and eye gouges and stuff. And then it became kind of like a housewife like meme thing where it's just like you go in there once a week and you go like, you know, half speed on like a few complicated techniques that would never actually work in the real world.
Yeah,
It's
there's
just
quite a
cash
few
cow.
people who are in the martial art world who have some choice words for those things, because you're giving people a false sense of security that they think they know how to deal with a tough situation, and that's just not the case. It's like you don't understand
Oh, the
at
best
all
are
what's
those
going
martial
on.
arts where they push the gun away from their face. Like that's like the ultimate meme of self-defense martial arts.
Yeah.
Like in reality, that person just shot you in the face at least once.
Yeah. He might even got 2 or 3 off into you.
Yeah.
Oh, I mentioned a keto earlier. That's like again another. It's like the pinnacle of no sparring. They don't do any sparring. When I was doing this research, I found this guy on YouTube who was ex Aikido black belt. He had trained Aikido for 10 years and was, I think, a second tier black belt. And he had never been in a ring, in a sparring ring. He had never sparred once in his entire life after 10 years of training Aikido. And he's a really interesting guy because he went and found a semi-professional MMA fighter to like test his Aikido against, and they do like a half-speed sparring session, and it's just like an absolute massacre. Like he can't even touch this guy. Like he gets punched repeatedly in the face, and the guy's like going like pretty easy on him because he just want to murder this dude. But it's just crazy how ineffective. He's been doing this for 10 years and like 5-6 times a day, black belt, or 5-6 times a week, black belt. Like, and he can't. He looks like it's his first ever fight because it is. And the guy
Man,
was
how tilted would you be to realize you just pissed away 10 years?
Yeah, the guy's really interesting because he just like he started training jiu-jitsu and I think Muay Thai and a few other things after, and just he documents all his progress and like comparing his journey on like, but this amateur MMA fighter was like, yeah, I could tell like you've never been in a ring, like you like flinch whenever I go to punch, and like you would go to grab me and then you'd like shy away every time I punch because you'd never been punched. And he's like, yeah, no, it's pretty much. Like,
yeah, well, it's
until
I can't remember which MMA fighter said this, or it might have even been Tyson, Mike Tyson, that said this. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face. I think that's Tyson actually.
Yeah.
The second that happens, because I've done like a few like MMA brawls when I was like younger with friends, and yeah, the second somebody knows, because I fought against like a couple hockey players who had been in a bunch of hockey brawls, and it's just like the experience is so important. If you don't have it, you just have no idea what you're doing. It's just you're a deer in the headlights. It block up, freeze up. I got a rib crack over just because of that. Just had no idea what to do and just ate a shot right away. It's like, oh, okay. If I actually want to do this type of stuff, like you actually have to train in full tilt situations like consistently.
The other interesting point that this guy had, this Aikido guy, he said like even when he got like quite experienced with jiu-jitsu and other stuff, when he was doing that, he never once cracked out an Aikido move. Like it was never like he was like,
that's like the oddest part.
I got over my like fear of actual fighting, and like I kind of got comfortable in like a physical conflict, and then like the 10 years of training kicked in, and I was able to like bust out some moves that I'd learned in this in this 10 years. No, it was like every single time he resorted to his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or his Muay Thai training that he had done, and never ever kicked out Aikido moves out of nowhere, which it just shows you like how you have to train it in a pressure environment for it to ever come back, like to ever be utilized like with muscle memory in a stressful situation where you're facing someone. You cannot incorporate anything without doing it in sparring and actual fight situation.
Well, and even if you never do sparring, then how do you evolve the techniques or figure out what works? Like, it just seems like a broken system, pretty through and through.
Well, and that you see like a lot of that with like again like picking on Aikido again. You see a lot of like these really really elaborate techniques and complicated techniques, and it's because like none of the bullshit gets shaved off by like
Yeah,
running
like,
into reality.
and it just makes sense logically, right? When you go to execute a move and somebody does something, like if you're actually sparring in a proper like in a full tilt situation, and you go to execute a move, people are going to start doing things that you wouldn't really have thought of, and then your entire sequence that you had planned out just falls apart. But if you continuously pressure test it, you're going to pick up patterns that people regularly, like, they'd be more subtle things, but when you do X, person usually reacts with Y, then you can actually build out a move sequence that works. That's one of the reasons why BJJ is so interesting. It's, a lot of people describe it as a big chess game, and it's based on real world experience of what do people actually do when you stick get your underhook in on the left side and start moving in a particular direction, right? Like, people will naturally gravitate towards certain things, right? Like certain like moves, and then you can plan for that, and then that whole chess game evolves. And yeah, exactly. Like, if you're not pressure testing, it's just you go to execute your little sequence, and then somebody just steps forward, clocks you in the face. It's like, oh well, you only learn that once you actually try it.
What I find funny in my gym is there's about maybe 10 people who go to do BJJ, and you'll see the meta of our own gym evolving as like one person figures out something neat to do, and then everyone copies it because we're all like, there's 10 people, and then now everyone's copying it, and then someone else figures out some way to exploit that, and it's like, this is real-time evolution just with a small group of people.
Yeah, and you see that on BJJ on the large scale, like, particularly with Gordon Ryan and whatnot. Him and because he's the number one competitor for no-gi, and he'll figure out something, and then he says people will adapt to that pretty quickly because they're all top level competitors, and then he'll figure out something to that, the counter to the counter, and then he said it just keeps going, and that's the sport.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that is interesting because one of the Gracies said that Aikido would be the best martial art if anyone could do any of the moves. Like, like if any human was capable of actually putting into practice what the theory, it would just be god tier. But since
it's like the definition of intellectualizing something until it's worthless.
Yeah, it's just like, since people have like human reaction times and human physical limitations, they can't actually.
So you're saying it's because they haven't developed their ki enough?
Yeah, it's like, surely there's some super god, super master that in some cave somewhere that has the reaction time and strength and skill and speed that will bring it all together and just be able to one shot everyone. But until we find that man in the cave, it's just not for us.
He honed his skills on fighting bears, so it might not be applicable
for the next 50 years, and then he'll emerge from the cave.
Yeah, so until we find that man, it's not very useful for us mere mortals. But yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else we want to say about application of martial arts for self-defense?
I don't think I have anything more on self-defense.
I think that summed it up pretty well.
Yeah, I'm good. Do we want to cover MMA further or anything else?
I think there could just be a couple things on just like the overall benefits of martial arts and whatnot. Like, because we were saying that, like, a lot of these things are being shown to be, like, a lot of these martial arts are being shown to be pretty much worthless for martial arts fighting and also for self-defense, which makes a lot of sense. But I still think that, at least from the research that I was going through, even the ones that might be a little bit more on that internal woo-woo side, there definitely seems to be some substantial benefits for people because it gets them moving, it gets them it just gets them active, and
I
it
do
also
want to throw in.
yeah.
I was interested to learn that there were so many martial arts that just as their primary focus did not involve fighting. It was kind of a naive assumption that I had that martial arts primary focus was fighting. So if a martial art was bad at fighting, then it was not as good. But if your primary focus is, cultivating the individual spirit or whatever, however you want to phrase it, basically a self-help program or a philosophy or a religion aspect, and then you're not good at fighting, the martial art can still be achieving its goals even though it's not very good at fighting. Although if it's completely terrible at fighting, that's a pretty bad look.
Yeah, I would say if it's billing itself as self-defense or as a fighting tool, and it's bad at that, then that I think is a problem just for anybody who is participating in it. But I think it's still it's like yoga, right? Like is yoga gonna, teach you how to defend yourself because you're really flexible? Like obviously not, but I think there is, at least from what I can see, these when they were putting people into these into studies and seeing the results, let me go find it here. They actually saw increase in bone density, bone mineralization, let's see here. There's a bunch of other things. Balance. They were putting people in, middle-aged participants in. They were finding a lot of health benefits like aerobic capacity, balance, strength, body, weight loss. But they were also finding, I think I mentioned this earlier, kids had improved self control, self image and whatnot. One of the really good ones was a big study with all of the studies, though they're pretty small. There needs to be a lot more done, but the ones that I could find. So one was 207 children that they, from kindergarten to grade 5, that they randomly assigned to Taekwondo for physical education or traditional physical education for 3 months, and they found that they were looking at self-regulation, so how well the kids were at regulating themselves, and also performance on math tests and whatnot, focus. So they had 3 pillars that they were studying, cognitive, affective, and physical. And basically the results showed that the martial arts group for the Taekwondo, even though they weren't doing Taekwondo sparring and actually kicking each other in the head, but they found that the martial arts group had overall better self-regulation in response to a challenge. They had more improvement in prosocial behavior. They even had increased arithmetic scores, which was rather interesting. And this was particularly effective for the boys. The girls saw not much of a boost, but overall the boys saw a pretty good boost across the board. And
could you imagine doing martial arts instead of gym class? It'd be so much better.
Yeah, I think the reason for that is that I think the boys get more engaged, right? That would be my guess. They're oh, this is kind of cool. I get to learn how to kick people.
I hear they've banned dodgeball in a lot of schools now, and it's that was the only memorable aspect of gym class.
Man,
if you don't have dodgeball, what do you have?
We did dodge hockey pucks. So we get all the little orange hockey pucks, and half the boys would line up on one side of the gym, the other half on the other side, and we'd just start fucking hammering the pucks at each other until somebody got slap shot right in the face, and that kind of put an end to it. But it was glorious while it lasted.
Well, I'm just looking at the studies. It just seems there's not much there, because it's what is a traditional, physical education? I think you'd need to have a lot more wings of the study where you're comparing it to, say, I don't know, competitive, a competitive basketball.
Yeah, I do think that
or it just might be.
It might not
traditional
be
physical education is dog shit. And
Yeah, exactly.
You give them anything slightly better than dog shit, it improves the outcome. Like, it's not that hard.
Yeah.
So I'm like super skeptical of like that being like some magic. And
No,
also,
and I don't think any of this, like, I don't think any of the studies really indicate that there is something truly special about martial arts that you can't get from another type of physical activity that incorporates much of the same. Like, I think, for some people, like a yoga, like being deeply embedded in a yoga practice would give similar, or maybe for some better, right? Like, I don't think there is a special sauce.
Well, I was just going to say, like, you were talking about how, like, older people had increases in, like, vascular function. Is like, yes, like, any exercise will do that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
To be honest, like, a lot of exercise is a lot cheaper and more accessible than martial arts. Like, whatever, a karate school might be $200 a month. And it's like,
you could go for nice jogs, light jogs.
You go for a jog or a long walk. Like, it's really not that hard of, like, I guess I'm just like, I wouldn't want to wrap up the benefits with martial arts if it's not the martial art, because a lot of the times the martial arts are not accessible and they're not affordable. So, like, why make that the bar when you could have them do something that's much more accessible and much cheaper?
And I would 100% agree with that. I think that there is some cases where the martial art itself would probably be a bit better than other things, like particularly for guys and girls who want like some sort of competitive sport that's on the physical end, and they like that where it really scratches the itch. Like for me, I find that like BJJ, I got a lot more benefit. I get a lot more benefit from it comparatively to some, like, because I do other physical activity as well, and this one is by far the most engaging and interesting that I've done. And obviously, like, N of 1 is worthless, but I have found that it is pretty useful, and I would guess that looking at like doing a proper study on it, even comparing to like other things, for some people it's probably going to be quite beneficial. Though then again, you can get yourself pretty injured in this sport, or in some martial arts.
I think the biggest thing, I find it hard to imagine there'd be any particular physical benefits to martial arts, if not, like, martial arts probably have deficiencies that would be better addressed. Like, you'd get more benefit from going to the gym properly. But I think the big benefit from martial arts would be seen it in practice, where you have that sense of community. Like, ideally, probably not in all cases, but if you have a sense of community and belonging and sort of purpose to your martial art as opposed to going to the gym.
Yeah, like a solitary venture.
I find it so difficult to go to the gym, so that even though I think going to the gym would probably be physically better for me, it's just not practically better for me because I don't do it. Like, even if I have a membership, I just don't have the psychological will to pursue it.
I agree. Although I think, like, again, that's why you'd have to measure it against other things, like, say, intramural sports, like competitive sports, like hockey or basketball or any of these other things that have that competitive edge, have that community involvement. And I think the one thing that a lot of people would say find particularly attractive about jiu-jitsu is you get that community aspect while it's still being like an individual sport. You don't need to, like, say,
you don't need to do the teamwork.
Well, if you're part of a team, like say a hockey team, then you have to show up on like game day because, and it's like, if you're part of a jiu-jitsu gym, you can just go on the days that work for you. You're sick, you don't have to show up. You're not feeling, you're not feeling it that day, you don't have to show up. So you can still like set your own schedule and be, 100% in charge of it, and it, totally up to you. But you still get to do like something that's social and kind of a team orientation and community orientation, versus like something like hockey where it's like, well, you guys practice on Tuesday nights at 7:30, that's only ice time, and your games are always Saturday at 11 a.m. and there's like, if you don't show up, then you don't get to play, and if you keep not showing up, you're off the team because you're just a giant liability. So I don't know. I think that's there's more individual sports than just martial arts that are like that, but I think that is one like kind of unique combination that martial arts has in the sense of like being a individual sport and but also having community and team aspects too, right?
The other thing I've noticed is with it being an individual sport, having not really done individual sports, is that you actually get to gauge your own improvement and like you improve at the pace you push yourself. Whereas in a team sport, it's incredibly disheartening to be trying really hard surrounded by people who don't care and they just want to drink beers afterwards. So then you don't try really hard.
That's true. Yeah, that's exactly going back to like you're 100% in control of it, right? Like you're in control of how much effort you put in and how much effort you don't put in and all of that, which is can be for a lot of people, especially thinking like this era, like where a lot of community stuff has kind of fallen away is like extra like nice in the sense like it's just so much easier to fit into your life than a lot of the community stuff where it's just like yeah, there's not a lot and there's like less community stuff now than ever. Like intramural sports leagues and stuff are just like disappearing, whereas like it seems like martial arts is growing. So it's just, I don't know, it's easier and easier to get into martial arts, whereas I think it's actually harder and harder to get into like team based sports at least at like the kind of casualish hobbyist level.
Yeah, I think you brought up probably the most difficult aspect of sports with the scheduling. Like for adults these days, that's so hard.
Yeah, and I think it just in cities too, it's just there's so much like moving around and mobility and stuff where people just, you're not just going to stay with the same team for decades or years or whatever, and then it's
Yeah.
you can kind of like pick up and go with martial arts, right? You just you move to a new city, you just join a new jiu-jitsu gym or more.
Yeah, we have quite a few people over the last little while who have kind of come in and out of our gym who are just in my city for work or whatever, and they're like, oh yeah, I gotta be here for 2 months, 3 months, whatever it is. They just come to the BJJ gym, and then when they're done their training or whatever it is, they just go back home and back to their own gym. It's really nice that way, for sure. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, and just to reiterate the point, I don't think that martial arts has some sort of secret special sauce when it comes to the exercise and whatnot. I think you can get that from pretty much like almost infinite amount of sources for different sports and whatnot. I do think, however, though, there is some value into like if you have the internal, like that internal, and the internal aspect to it and the philosophy aspect to it. While I don't have any real like studies on that, I actually do think having a like if you're part of some sort of martial arts group that actually does take on board and take seriously the like a philosophy side of things, I think that is extremely helpful for a lot of people. Like there's quite a few stories of like, kids being able to get some valuable life lessons and getting themselves out of tough situations, basically like tough living situations through martial arts. And I think that shouldn't be discounted. I think it can turn into the woo-woo garbage that, where somebody's just, spouting off pretty much nonsense about, like your life will become better once you master your chi. But I do believe that if you have a martial art that has a proper moral framework behind it, that can be very beneficial to people. It just seems rather obvious to me that if you have a good, strong community within that martial art organization and they do have a code and then also enforce that code, if, like one of their members violates it by, he's going out and doing some bad things and they put pressure on him to knock it off because, it's going against their their ethics. Like, I can't see that being a bad thing. I don't think a lot of, like, your standard BJJ gym or Muay Thai gym is probably not going to do that, but it's just like a bit of a defense of those more internal martial arts.
Yeah, I would argue that it's just better to separate the two. Like, why? I don't know. In my opinion, it just doesn't make much sense to like tack on spiritual stuff to the.
I don't think you have to. Like, the professor at my gym it's not spiritual, but it's there is like an ethical component to it, and he's not, he doesn't stand there bloviating for an hour about things, but he certainly takes that internal aspect seriously. And for our group, it's, there is additional support and whatnot because of it. And because he also walks the walk, right? Like, when a member is having a tough time or something like that, loses a job or whatever, he's tapping that network to help him out. We've helped out some Ukrainian refugees who came over that were part of BJJ, and he's, hooked them up with work and whatnot. And it comes down from, living the values that he does like to preach. And I think, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there needs to be a separation. I think you don't have to have it, but I do think it's valuable. And I think for those that enjoy that, and like my gym clearly does, and it's working out.
I'd be really interested in seeing what they actually do in martial arts that have more of that internal aspect, because I've definitely never been involved with anything like that.
Yeah.
I think what you're describing though, Con, is like not much different than what a lot of, say, any sort of loose community or group organization does. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, like a hockey team might do something like that. A hockey team
or a hockey league or, a book club, for fuck's sakes, could do that, right? Like, I think when people talk about like the internal version of martial arts, is really, really focusing in on that like Buddhist, Eastern religion aspect that a lot of these things are connected to, which, again, I really would not see as the same thing as just having, ethical stand. Like, I think any group or organization it's good to have, ethical standards of conduct for members, and the degree to which that extends beyond the confines of the organization, I think, is up to each, individual organization and group. But like, not being a dick and respecting your, fellow members, and even, helping them out and stuff like that. I think that's far from being limited to martial arts. And it's really not what I would be pointing towards when I talk about like the spiritual aspect or the internal.
You're more
aspect.
referencing the
Buddhist, Zen meditation, and the, Eastern mysticism and all this stuff. Like, that's really what a lot of and even some of like the more kind of holdover, like in the belt system with the hierarchy and the bowing to the master, because the master knows all, has all answers, is basically your god, and your in some of the martial arts, it's basically like the master is your life coach and your cult leader, and they tell you how to live, they tell you what to do. It's kind of culty, like go watch IP Man, and they all wear the same uniform, they all complete deference to the master, and they I guess what I'm saying is like that kind of stuff to me just seems a little too far. Like,
yeah, well, if it turns into what is basically a pseudo cult, then that's obviously not great. But even having a bit of that spirituality, I don't think is a big deal. But of course, if anything's taken too far, it becomes a problem.
I think that spiritual cult is more the norm than the like. Once you get into the philosophy and stuff being incorporated, I'd imagine that's more of the norm. The the strangest example in history with the cult aspect would be the Boxer Rebellion in China, where they basically got 100,000 secret society martial arts practitioners rise up and start a revolution in an attempt to throw out the Europeans. And it's like, that's one of the craziest things. So they called it the Boxer Rebellion because Westerners just called all Chinese martial arts boxing. So a bunch of boxers decided to revolt against the Western imperialism.
That's pretty.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
So yeah, that was kind of more the thing I was getting at is, I think emphasizing just the kind of basic community and everything. I think like what Colin you're describing is kind of something we forgot, which is basic community decency and community support, which is so rare in Western civilization at this point that
it's now viewed as culty.
Is I would say it's almost a human instinct to engage in those sort of things as soon as like in a community, because even on the internet you see hints of that, usually in small communities, and usually it weirds you out to the point where you leave if you're me. but it's like you can definitely see a sort of that, like anytime there's a community, there's some sort of implicit ethics that arise, and you want to help each other out kind of deal. And then that just weirds me out and I leave.
Well, yeah, again, I think that's because so much of our community, like, cohesion has gone away, and so much of the organizations and groups that provide a community have gone away, and people are just like so atomized that they don't really have exposure to a lot of that anymore. And I agree with Con that I think it like that kind of thing is actually good to promote in something like a jiu-jitsu gym or a martial arts gym in general. But again, I just think there you can kind of draw a more or less bright line between that and just spiritual.
Yeah, and I would agree with that.
So
Is
it's like, oh well, like you have to believe in this way of like viewing the world and detachment from personal like bringing in like the Buddhist teachings or like again like that I think that's a bright line between those two things that doesn't really need to be lumped together.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't know, that's all I got.
yeah, that's it for me as well.
Yeah, I think we did a pretty fair job of rambling about martial arts that we aren't experts in for quite a while.
Yeah,
No,
Phil, 2 hours of
here, Mark. So I'm basically, I don't know. I'm like, if this was, one of the McDojos, I'd be halfway to my black belt.
You hate to see it. Just still a white belt after a year. Yikes.
Yeah, I should be at least up 3 belts, and I mean, as long as I pay the $3.99 per belt, like obviously, like can't forget about that.
Yeah.
All right.
Peace.